So I want to talk about renunciation tonight. And I think it's a very underrated talk, personally. This morning we talked about purpose. We talked about general comprehension and understanding the purpose of what we're doing in any moment. Oh, thank you for that reminder. I forgot in my enthusiasm to talk about renunciation, but I wasn't mic'd up. Okay, that's better, yes. So we talked about connecting with our purpose, and the Buddha is very explicit in many ways about the purpose of his teaching and the purpose of the Dharma. And he never wavers from that in all his teaching. He always comes back, as does the lineage of teachers, always comes back to the essential invitation and renunciation of greed, hatred, and delusion as the purpose of not only the teachings, because the teachings are about our lives, and you could say that it's the purpose of our lives, that we are born to heal, and that healing is to renounce and relinquish greed, hatred, and delusion. That's one way of talking about it. This is what he says in the Sanguttara Nikaya 56. And I've substituted monks for practitioners. And this, practitioners, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, the remainderless fading and cessation, the renunciation and relinquishment, the release and letting go of craving and aversion and delusion, in parentheses. He says then, this is peace, this is exquisite, and this is the highest happiness. I love that. So when we contemplate that, when we contemplate how the Buddha has framed his teachings as freedom and liberation, as nirvana, as the highest peace, then inherent in that is the relinquishment, release, the letting go, and the renunciation of the obstacles or the obstructions to that. And again, he never, and our lineage never wavers from pointing to the single, the cause, the single cause over and over again, which is craving, and its other expression as aversion, and the core of that expression, which is ignorance. He never wavers from that. Over and over again, he names these energies as the cause of our suffering, and that the relinquishment and renunciation of those energies means the freedom and the release of the heart and mind from suffering. When those are remainderless, when there's no more of those energies, then there is the highest peace. And it is a law. It's not like, for some of you, yes, and for some of you, not, according to your personality or gender expression or orientation or history or past. It is, he's saying that this is lawful. So that's why then renunciation is in the Eightfold Path. So for those of us who are newer to the practice, just to name again that the Buddha said, he just sort of cut through all the stories, the particular stories, and said, there is suffering, there is the ending of suffering, there's a cause of suffering rather, there's the ending of it, and there is a path to the ending of it. And in that path to the ending of it, he names right view or right understanding, right? Right intention or right thought. Then those two as one subsection, and then the next section, which is how we act in the world. So what's our understanding and what's our thinking, right? Then how does that get translated into the world as right action, right speech, right action, and right livelihood? And then in that translation of right view and right understanding into action comes the field and the basis in which to cultivate the three qualities: mindfulness, well, I'll do it in the correct order, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. But they really work together, those three qualities that work together, that then propel in that whole context the mind into the path. The path, it is a path, the development, the process, the unfolding into freedom, however that takes place. So in right intention or right thought is the practice of renunciation. And there are three invitations, just to be comprehensive about the practice of right intention. One is renunciation, and then the other is the intentional cultivation of goodwill, which is, of course, the antidote to the lack of goodwill or aversion, and then refraining from harming or harmlessness. So we could say there's the practice of renunciation, there's a practice of loving kindness and compassion, that's goodwill, and then the practice of refraining from harming is the practice of the precepts. And those are the three practices of right intention or right thought. I was going to say this later, but now I feel impelled to say this. So, right thought or right intention, this is what the Buddha says about it. Practitioners, whatever a practitioner frequently thinks, ponders upon, that will become the inclination of the mind. And what is right thought? The thought of renunciation, the thought of non-ill will, the thought of harmlessness. This is called right thought. And then there is a very famous first verse of the Dhammapada, which I can't remember exactly, but says something like, whatever we think will always follow us like the wheel of an ox cart. Can anyone remember? It's such a beautiful verse in my memory.
It's like a shadow.
Like a shadow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one. Whatever's thought of, it's like a shadow or like a wheel of an ox cart, something like that. That is that there is always a consequence, right, to thinking, and that that consequence will always follow us. That is the power of thought. And we acknowledge that, right? We acknowledge it and we forget it, and then we acknowledge it over and over again. So, for example, I like to call on, because it's such a powerful image, the image of the Grand Canyon. And I love that image because that image is the kind of chasm created in our minds from one river running down those rocks, running along those rocks over eons. And that's what a thought can do in our neural network. And I sometimes feel when I'm countering a judgment, and one of the judgments that most comes up is when I give a lousy Dharma talk. And it'll come up. And I'll feel how deeply ingrained that thought is. How it's like that thought is so ingrained, it's the Grand Canyon in my mind. And it takes that much effort. Now, thank goodness, it's not as bad as it used to be. But if you've hiked the Grand Canyon or any big hike, it takes tremendous effort to get out of that canyon, right? And that's the kind of effort we've had to make over some of our thoughts, the thoughts we've had of shame and blame, the thoughts that of ill will, which is what shame and blame are. Every thought is like a car driving down the road and leaving an imprint on the soil. And the more that car drives down that same road, the more of a rut until it's the Grand Canyon. That's the power of thought. And that's what the Buddha is talking about, is that the consequences of thinking a thought over and over again. And when we don't understand that, and when we don't contemplate it, then there isn't so much energy to get ourselves out, to say no way, right? So then, just to use another iconic image of the Buddha in his enlightenment process, calling on the earth, right? Calling on the power of the earth to witness his right to awaken. And this is my interpretation. All these energies of seduction were coming into his mind in just preceding his awakening. And he was calling on the powers, as I do sometimes, like I am calling on you, earth, and all devas and supportive energies to help me renounce this thought. Right? Because it's one of those thoughts that have ingrained themselves deeply into the psyche. And it takes that kind of calling. I am calling on the earth to bear witness to my right to extricate myself from this. So, the power of thinking. So then the Buddha brings in this invitation of renunciation to catch the thought, and to renounce it, to catch thoughts of ill will and to renounce them, to catch any thought that precedes breaking the precepts, any intention that breaks the precepts, any intention to harming, to catch it. And of course that's why mindfulness is so brilliant, because it is mindfulness that catches it. And that's why we keep practicing and cultivating mindfulness, because without mindfulness we don't perceive it, and without the perception we are bound and imprisoned in the ruts that we've karmically inherited, that we've inherited from the culture and what our pets and families and so on. So in order to feel the enthusiasm to renunciation, the Buddha also invites us to really inquire into experience and learn about suffering. Because renunciation is about the mechanism of ending it. But to end it, we need to understand it and to know it. And so I've been saying more recently, because I really loved it, and when I sat a retreat with U Tejaniya, and he said actually to someone else who was talking about his struggle, U Tejaniya said, don't be afraid to suffer. Like when you find yourself in a place of suffering, don't be afraid to suffer. Don't think like, oh, this is terrible, I shouldn't be suffering. Rather, explore it. Like, what is the experience of suffering? Where is it that constitutes suffering? Because it's so interesting that over and over again I think it's always interesting in the interviews when you share the challenges and we explore it together, and it comes out over and over again that really the reason for the suffering is not wanting or wanting it to be different. Just what the Buddha said. It's craving or wanting something to be different, or not wanting, another way of saying it, what's happening. It's one thing to learn this intellectually as a framework, and then it's really terrific to perceive it over and over again. Oh, that's the issue. Like, over and over again, I'm like, I'm calling love, I'm trying to hold this. What the hell is going on? It keeps coming up, the thought over and over. I understand it's really about feeling invisible. That's my, the big way I name one of the sort of core traumas of my life. Why the hell am I always thinking? And then it's like, oh, I haven't caught that I think I shouldn't be experiencing this. Aversion. Not wanting. And it's so lovely to inquire into our experience, and particularly when we're in suffering. But when we're in suffering, of course, the nature of suffering is that it's very difficult to perceive things. But here, in the context of a retreat, it's easier to actually bring mindfulness and to ask, first off, as soon as there's any kind of contraction or struggle, where is the wanting and not wanting? And just over and over again, where is the wanting and not wanting? Now, when the Buddha says to let go of wanting and not wanting, of craving and clinging or aversion, hatred and ill will, it's very much, at least in my own understanding of my process, a summary of the path, right? A summary, because we have been naming it, some of us, in a slightly different way, a way that for me more easily calls in non-opposition or caring and loving to the process. And so another way to frame this is that the homelessness or the sense of not feeling complete in our lives, in however you take that for yourself, or not free, gets triggered over and over again by trauma, by this culture, by any time we haven't been respected and cared for. Basically, whenever those probably uncountable times when we haven't been respected and cared for, that wiring of delusion and ignorance gets triggered. And that's why it's as deep as the Grand Canyon. And so, in the turning and the orientation towards freedom and healing, without having the teachings of the Dharma or education that teaches us what the correct path is, the mind automatically goes to the defenses of this dynamic, which is greed, clinging, so misunderstanding that sensual pleasure is the path to healing. The trauma and the dis-ease that is part of the way ignorance lives inside of us. So I know I'm going fast for some of you, and others of you have heard this quite a few times, so I'm trying to go the middle way here. When we understand it that way, when we understand it as not a hindrance, I was talking to one of you about a hindrance, but as this misunderstanding of trying to find relief from suffering, of trying to protect through anger, of trying to protect also through fantasy, confusion and delusion. When we understand that these are uneducated attempts to protect ourselves, then not like, this is a feminist reinterpretation of the three poisons, right? Because they're called poisons. They're not poisonous in the sense of I'm this evil person, but rather a misunderstanding. And I just really appreciate that when I watch myself get into, for example, I have to control this. Like, that's one of many of our scenes, right? We have to control things. And sometimes it's like, I'm out of control and wanting to control. It's like so intense. And it's, and I mean, I could see it as craving and attachment to ego. But honestly, that isn't as helpful as saying something is going on and it's trying to defend me. And what is it that's going on? Can I drop? Can I move into an exploration of what it is? Can I bring my caring and my love to this particular defense mechanism? And at least, even if it's in retrospect, acknowledge what was going on. So there's that particular perspective as well. Sometimes it's just helpful to say, cut it, Arena. This is a poison. This is one of the poisons. Cut it. So for example, I'm trying to think what's blaming, right? Something happens in a relationship and you're into blame. And it's aversion and ill will, and I've gone through, how many of us, especially if we're aversive, I'm aversive because I've been doing it so many lifetimes, apparently, according to the Buddha. So, and there it is, and I know to drop the storyline, and it comes up, and it's just like, absolutely cut it. If this is your suffering, cut it, So sometimes it's just like name it as the poison and cut it. Sometimes that's helpful. And then sometimes it isn't. And so we get to decide for ourselves what's useful in what situation in order to name the suffering and the causes of suffering, to see it, and then what to bring to what support to bring to renunciation, that quality of letting go. What helps you to bring what support, that's what I mean. What support will help you to renounce the causes of suffering. So again, in an interview, we spoke about the incredible blessing of love. How bringing love to these dynamics, the clinging, the controlling, the holding on, the I don't care that the Buddha says craving the sensual pleasure is going to bring me suffering, I just want it. That, that, it's like, may I care for this dynamic? May I care for this dynamic? And immediately that intention of non-harming begins to change, even if it's fractionally, the intensity of that dynamic. So for some of us, especially those of us who are aversive, caring is a really beautiful antidote to these energies, because it creates the field in which letting go happens. And so, my practice around letting go almost always starts with, may I care? May I care for you? The other, and this is the Buddha must have been a greedy personality, because of the way that he talks about renunciation. If you happen to have a greedy personality, that is that you just see the positive qualities of everything all the time, then naming things as unwholesome and productive of suffering is really one of the paths for renunciation. So, for example, Joseph Goldstein talks about a time when he was doing a 3-month retreat with U Pandita in Burma, and he had this really hard time. It was just like he was in pain and pain, and it was pain, and it was just really an uphill slog for 2 months. And then it broke open, and he was in bliss. And so you interview with U Pandita every day. So day after day, U Pandita asks, so what's happening in your meditation? And Joseph says, bless. And then after the 6th day, U Pandita says, so what's happening in your meditation? Joseph says, bless. Fine, very fine, subtle sensations. And U Pandita says, enough clinging, Joseph, let go. And Joseph says, I didn't realize that actually it was my clinging that kept that fine bliss in place over and over again. Because pleasant experiences are so seductive, we don't see the suffering in them. And when we don't see the suffering, we don't see the clinging. And so then there's no way to deepen in the practice. And that's what U Pandita was saying. So if you happen to be someone, so I ask you some of the time how things, good, great. Next time I'll interview you, good, great. I'm like, okay, greedy person. So then it's like really looking at, oh yeah, things are great. Things are good. Like looking for the clinging that's holding that in place, because things are never good all the time according to the law of unsatisfactoriness.
So is that the key? I'm almost not understanding what you're saying in a way.
You're not? Could I finish it and come back?
Yeah.
Okay. So keep the question.
Yeah.
So, and then of course for the personality who is deluded, it's actually cultivating the quality of focus, of really becoming laser-like in your inquiry into what's going on. So bringing focus in to see the nature of suffering. There's so renouncing the causes of suffering. I know I say it almost every day, but it just bears saying. Part of the practice of renunciation means to renounce a storyline, whatever the thought is. So I had said yesterday in the group sharing, if you have a thought more than 3 times, let go of the thought because it's skewed and distorted. Otherwise you wouldn't have had it for the 3rd time. So, and of course any thought that you have more than 3 times, totally let go because it's distorted. So it's being fueled by one of the unwholesome qualities. And we can't access what the fuel is as long as we believe the story. So another way to say that is if there isn't caring or faith or patience or flexibility or compassion or joy or equanimity associated with the thought, for sure the thought in some way is distorted and you can drop it. And so the practice of renunciation is a deep invitation to drop our storylines. Most of the thoughts we have been constructed in that scenario of defending ourselves. And in order to survive in this culture. So I happened to read a story of Michelle Pfeiffer and some other film actress. And they both said the same thing, but someone who's younger than Michelle Pfeiffer and more famous. They both said that they felt like they were frauds. Frauds. Yeah, that they really didn't deserve to be where they are. That's a story. And we all carry sort of stories like that. And totally understandable. They're stories of defense. You know, if I didn't carry a story like that, and I directly competed with my father, I would have been beaten, for example. So we do all kinds of things in order to survive in situations where strong women are targeted. And so then we go to, I can't, I really, whatever. Not true. But how true they feel. Grand Canyon. That's the Grand Canyon. The deeper it is, the truer it feels, even though it's totally not true. So I can't, personally, from my own experience, say enough about relinquishing all stories, and really relinquishing thinking, especially on a retreat. I mean, now I'm giving a Dharma talk and the cognitive capacity is being engaged. But I really do believe no thought is worth thinking on a retreat unless it's spontaneous Dharma. insight or understanding. And that isn't even on a thinking level, that's always on an insight level, which is under the thinking. It's not conceptual. It's pre-conceptual insight. So, Kalu Rinpoche was such a beautiful teacher, and he said, we live in the prison of our thoughts, and I love that. That's just such a beautiful description of our minds, isn't it? We live in the prison of our thoughts. So cool. In talking about this, in offering invitations of renunciation and relinquishment, we then come up against that wish to be free, and to be free according to our own timeline. Okay, I'm ready now. Let go. Bloody hell, will you just let go? It reminds, I just had this image because I'm reading a book by Jamie. It's a beautiful book about the horse scene, horses and racing. And, and some horse owners not really respecting their horses, kind of the mythic Black Beauty, are like beating their horses to run faster. But in that relationship, their horses never do. And that's us. Come on already. What's the matter with you? Let go, right? And sort of like insisting as though we're beating ourselves, and in a way we are. And part of the practice of renunciation is letting go of our insistence of a particular timing, of this is how I think something should be. So when I first started having memories of some of my trauma in my early 30s, and I started therapy, I thought then, oh, okay, good, 10 years. I'm going to give it 10 years. I thought that was a very generous amount of time to deal with my trauma. So then you can imagine the suffering when the 10 years was up and I was already a mature practitioner of 12 years because I started meditating before therapy. And I was like, why am I still dealing with this? There must be something wrong with me. But there isn't. The whole process of opening and unfolding has its own law and its own timing, have you noticed? And it is a beautiful renunciation to give up a timeline on your own healing. So that's one of the reasons that I talked about lineage yesterday, because when I open up to acknowledge that whatever I carry, we carry, and whatever we carry is the story of humanity and our particular thread in that, then it's easier to drop my own personal agenda and timeline. It's like whatever I'm carrying in terms of what I go through when I meditate or in my life, this is like eons, according to the Buddha. And so whatever arises is like, okay, so this is what the universe is calling to me as it's happening through me to heal. It's not personal in that way, as in, oh, poor me, God, I can't believe I'm having this memory again. Not personal in that way, but more, this is how life is living through each one of us as a universal process. And each one of us is carrying that thread of ignorance and its defenses and the trauma of it. And so each one of us then, through the incredible blessedness, is saying, I am willing not to take responsibility as in own, but to hold, to take care of this and to heal this. And some of our greatest teachers, like Deepa Ma, were given tremendous amounts to carry. The death of her husband early on, after 20 years, the death of her first child, that waiting 20 years as an Indian woman to have a child, having a child and then that child dying. And I won't go on. But that's what she was given. As we all are given what we're carrying. We're all carrying that invitation for healing. And so how humble and what a relinquishment of the tightness of the heart in giving over a timeline at the same time we are saying, yes, I will devote my life to healing you so that my heart and mind are liberated, and the heart and mind then of the whole community. That is like deep. That's how I survive, really. And it just feels the difference between suffering and grace. So then just because some of us I don't know why I'm saying just because attachment to things lands differently for different personalities again. So for some personalities, things and holding onto them and caring for them, not caring for them, being attached to them, is one of the big challenges. And I used to be just so, it was such a trip to go to certain houses where there are these really expensive, beautiful things, and they're covered in plastic to protect them. Do you know? That kind of I have a beautiful thing, but I'm not going to enjoy it because I'm so attached to it changing that I'm going to cover it up so I can't even really see it properly. So, but we are all attached to our things, and in our last retreat, where we had a big turnover after 1 week, and so different people who had been on the retreat for a week found that some of the new people had taken their place. And there were all these notes to me. Someone has colonized my space. Outrage. So it's just great to see and acknowledge. And so I wanted to read such a beautiful teaching from Ajahn Chah about our relationship to things. And again, no blame and shame. At least for me, coming from one country to another, and because we left South Africa without taking anything, I treasure some of the things that I've managed to hold on to for the last 20 years. So I'm not saying that there isn't something beautiful in it, but here's what Ajahn Chah says. When a student asked Ajahn Chah why he used the same glass the whole time. Like he would always use this one particular glass. Ajahn Chah says, well, so do you see my glass? I love this glass. It holds water admirably. When the sun shines on it, it reflects the light beautifully. When I tap it, it has a lovely ring. Yet for me, this glass is already broken. When the wind knocks it over, or my elbow knocks it off the shelf, it falls to the ground and shatters. And I say, of course. When I understand that this glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious. So I'm just coming back to the indigenous, of many cultures, indigenous peoples' understanding of that we are caretaking and that we don't own. I'm caretaking the glass, I'm caretaking this body, I'm caretaking these clothes, and some of them have been passed on to me from others, most of my clothes actually, and so now I get to caretake them, and that we are only caretakers of our own lives, and then caretakers of whatever resources we find that we have access to. And of course in that relationship of caretaking, when we see it in that way rather than owning, then it becomes much easier to see, well, I can't actually take care of anymore. You know? Like having this is just makes it just is too much caretaking, so I have to relinquish in order to care for something properly. So exploring our relationship to things and where there might be clinging, the obstruction of the heart. And then I'm going to end in 5 minutes. But I wanted to say something about our culture that feels very interesting to me, because in some ways it feels like we're quite a radical culture. But it's interesting how little we talk about money to each other openly and honestly. I think it's fascinating. Meg and I were just talking about it. And what our relationship to money is. Because
what culture are you talking about?
Ours. Queer. Yeah, our queer culture. How we can talk about our feelings and our relationships, but we hardly ever talk about money and our relationship to money. In hardly any group sharing over the many years that Lotus Sisters has been retreating, has the question come up about our relationship to money. And to me that's very indicative of the ways there is a constriction around our relationship with money. And I think it would be really, in exploring renunciation and relinquishment, I think it would be wonderful to actually have a theme and an inquiry of what is our relationship with money? How do we feel about how much we have or how little we have? How do we hold that in community? Like, is the heart open or constricted around it? Just that. Because that's a big thing. So, and I think about it in caretaking because I feel so moved by the story, and it so inspired me in my own giving, actually, of Deepama, who was very poor, an incredible teacher and very poor, lived in one room in Calcutta. And so these students would come to this room. The dana she got, she would put under her mattress, and from Western students. And there was this young man who was a Jewish man whose parents, of course, wanted him to be a doctor. Very traditional wish in some Jewish families that the eldest son be a doctor or a lawyer. So this pre-med student decides to throw it all in and go to India and become a seeker. And his parents are super upset, like pissed off. And so he tells Deepama this. And then he goes off to an ashram and comes back to visit her. And she says, have you talked to your mother recently? Because it's the mom who's particularly upset. And he says, no. And she goes under the mattress and she takes almost all her money, which is $12, which is a lot of rupees. But she says, go buy your mother a gift. Make her happy. And that's the relationship of caretaking, where we have resources, and because it's only caretaking, it flows according to where it's needed. So it's just such a beautiful expression of an awakened heart and mind. And so exploring our relationship to things. And I think that's enough. I'm not going to go on to the precepts, but just to say that relinquishing whatever stops us living according to the precepts is one of the great relinquishment practices that we can do. Because that's enough. So let me read this last story. But before I do, I want to sort of address the sense of impoverishment sometimes that happens when we hear about talks of relinquishment. You know, that sense of, but life is so tough, I feel like I need to treat myself, you know, and so much of the stress of renunciation and craving is renouncing sensual pleasures of what gives us pleasure through taste or sound or looks. And so, oh, Jean, we forgot to do the 8 precepts. Oh, I'm so sorry, I just remembered. Because that's what the 8 precepts are about, is the relinquishment of beautification, relinquishment, I don't agree with this one, of singing and entertainment, and then relinquishment of eating afternoon. That sense of, no, I can't survive, how difficult it is unless I give myself these sensual pleasures. I wonder what it would be like to do a both and. To say, I understand that giving myself sensual pleasure is a temporary happiness and relief. And I also understand if I'm not practicing relinquishment, that I'm not freeing the heart and creating the conditions for nirvana. And how each one of us wants to take that up. Because the Buddha doesn't say enjoying things when they arise is wrong. He doesn't say that at all. He says when things are lovely, enjoy them. And don't make the mistake of thinking that's what it's all about. And so how much energy do we put into sensual pleasures? And just to begin a loving, caring inquiry into how can I begin to practice renunciation? Not as an asceticism, like I'm punishing myself, but where can I let go? Where can I begin to experience the strength and deeper nourishment that happens when I let go of those things? Because it means I'm turning to myself to resource. And that's what this path is about. It's saying the resource, the ultimate resource, is in this heart and mind. And I just notice that I can get a little lazy about that sometimes. Like, what should we do? Let's go for a nice this. Let's do a nice that. Nothing wrong with it. And yet on retreat, at least on the retreats that, almost all the retreats and the retreats that we've sat together, where there's a fair amount of relinquishment, I am so happy. So coming back to that deep orientation again, the circle of what is the purpose of my practice. And what is the purpose of my life? If it isn't nirvana, if it isn't the freeing the heart of the energies that obstruct love and presence. I think that's enough. Let's sit for a moment. Thank you.